Brian is a poet. He has degrees in computer science and philosophy from Brown, and then a MFA in poetry from University of Washington. Right?
Yeah.
And in 2009, which is the reason we're here, he competed for the Loebner Prize in the opposite one that you usually hear of, and he'll explain it, but the usual one is trying to get computer software to pretend it's a computer or to pretend it's human. He was working the other side of the coin and trying to convince people that he was in fact human, which is harder than it sounds. So you'll hear about why. Before we get in, I'm Thomas Goetz. I'm executive editor at Wired, which is just down the street on 3rd and Bryant. So I'm happy to be here and happy to be. This is too far away, actually.
Shall we?
So I wanted to. Why don't we start by having you explain the Turing Test and the Loebner Prize, because I think it's fascinating, and one of these things that at Wired we think of as is actually kind of it's like Moore's law. It's one of these things that is kind of a cliche, but it's a very kind of intricate standard and process. So go ahead, give us the bottom line.
Yeah. So some of us in the audience may be familiar with the Turing Test. Some people not so. It goes back to 1950 as the computer was first being invented. A lot of the pioneers in the field were already asking these really theoretical questions, like, can these things actually think? You know, could we build a machine at some point that could actually think or be intelligent or have a mind in a human sense? And the British mathematician Alan Turing said basically, well, we could philosophize about this all day, but instead let's just sort of put that to the side and just have a test that's just going to decide once and for all. And the way that the test is going to work is we'll assemble a panel of scientists. And these scientists are going to have 5-minute chat conversations, text conversations, half of which will be with humans that are hidden in a room down the hall typing on computers. And the other half will be with computer programs claiming to be people hidden in a room down the hall typing on computers. And so Alan Turing famously decreed in 1950 that if a computer program could fool the judges into thinking that it was a real person 30% of the time, then we'd basically have to just say, okay, that's intelligent.
And this was a thought experiment for 40 years, right? It was just a kind of notion that he had, but wasn't acted upon until Mr. Loebner came along, right?
That's right. A rogue plastic portable roll-up lighted disco dance floor salesman, New Jersey.
It's complicated.
By the name of Hugh Loebner steps in the year 1991 and says, you know, Alan Turing has had this idea that's been held to be this important theoretical idea now for 40 years. I think the technology's at a point where we're ready to actually hold these things, and I'm willing to put up my disco dance floor money to back it. And so since the early 90s, there has been an annual competition that he not so modestly names after himself, the Loebner Prize, to put Turing's theoretical ideas to the test.
Now, why did he think that? I mean, why did he think that technology was ready to put it to the test? How did he, as a expert in disco dance floors, perceive the world of artificial intelligence, which was at the time largely academic, right? I mean,
right.
There wasn't a lot of visible AI in 1991.
That's an extremely good question, and I actually have no idea.
Next book.
I know that he was excited about being the first, and I think that got him excited about it, whether or not the technology, in fact, was at that point.
Right.
But I think it was also, it was the beginning of the 90s. People were starting to have computers kind of appearing throughout their homes, and this notion of kind of talking back and forth with a program was starting to become a familiar concept to people. And, the first real chatbot, as they're known, had been around since the 60s. The fake Rogerian therapist program, Eliza, where you'd say, I'm feeling sad today, and it would say, I'm sorry to hear you're feeling sad. Tell me more about that. Which, as early as the 60s, was getting people to sort of pour their hearts out to it.
Well, you have this great little anecdote in your book about one of the actual was it one of the people behind the Loebner Prize was
duped.
Yeah.
Yeah, that's right. So there's this long kind of sordid history of people getting fooled into thinking that they were talking to a person. For me, the real gem of them all is in the year 2006, a psychologist by the name of Robert Epstein, who co-founded the Loebner Prize with Hugh Loebner, subscribed to a dating service online. He'd gotten divorced, and he was looking to meet new people and branch out, and he started exchanging these lengthy letters with a woman named Ivana, who claimed to be from the Russian city of Nizhny Novgorod. And he just really felt like they were hitting it off. She was telling him all about her family and all these things about how she had all these feelings for him and he should come and visit her. But very gradually started to sense that something was a little bit off. He would ask her these specific questions. She would respond in these very general ways. And long story short, 4 months into the relationship, realizes that actually it's a software program.
Whoa.
The world expert in AI.
And this is the founder of the Loebner Prize. So I feel like that's a milestone when the founder gets duped. Yeah.
So one thing I want to get into in part later on is how that largely, well, I might as well approach the issue now. So in 1991, that was largely an academic area, right? AI was the idea of a Turing test, and can a computer replicate it or pretend it's human in a convincing way, was something that was almost completely done in universities. But now you have chatbots and spam bots, and we actually have a world that is quite permeated by AI, right? I mean, it's
right.
all over the place.
Yeah, I mean, I think that's part of what fascinated me to be writing about the Turing test now, at this point, which is that not only is the Turing test, this idea, not only is it this competition that's held every year, but you could make the argument that, in fact, we're engaged in continuous Turing tests throughout the day. If I get an email from my friend and he says, hey, Brian, you're going to love this pharmaceutical discount it's just going to blow your mind. You can get this insane, Viagra for like 20 cents. I know that that's not really him talking. And so what I now find myself in the position of when I'm composing email, especially if I'm sending people links or something where they have to kind of trust me, is that I'm going out of my way to sound like myself. Mm-hmm. Which is essentially what it is to be in a Turing test. Yeah. So we've now gotten to the point where, whether we've heard of Turing's idea or not, this is now what it means to be in the 21st century, is this continuous vigilance that, in fact, you are not dealing with a computer that's posing as a person.
Right, and that's why we're inundated with CAPTCHAs, those codes we have to enter, and all these things that are basically trying to sniff out the bots among us. So you just noted that you have to be especially authentic, and that I think is kind of the arc of your book, is actually this quest that you go on to learn how to be more human, or to behave in a more human way in order to prepare for the test. Because you, the arc of the book is about your preparation, and then eventually your role as a competitor, one of the people in that room down the hall.
Yeah, that's right.
And so the very interesting and I think compelling thing you fix on is that it's not just enough to be yourself. You actually have to go beyond the way you ordinarily would behave in order to avoid some of the ways that maybe the AI community has figured out how to gain advantage.
Right, which to me seems extremely paradoxical. That perhaps the email that comes naturally to me is, "Hey, check this out," link. But I know that may raise their spam alarms.
Mm-hmm.
So now I have to sort of do this additional work to sound authentic. But is it inauthentic to work that hard? That's when it starts to get a little bit gnarly. But yeah, and I should say, like, these became questions that I thought about all the time because I found myself a participant in the 2009 Loebner Prize. So Turing's famous threshold was 30%. And in 2008, the top computer program at the Loebner Prize managed to fool 25% of the judges. So if it had fooled one more judge, it would have passed this extremely famous threshold.
Right.
And so that really perked my ears up. And I had this sort of strange feeling as a human that I wanted to prevent that from happening.
Yeah.
And so I took it upon myself to call the organizers and say, like, put me in the ring, and so I became, in 2009, one of the human confederates. So I was one of the people at these terminals trying to convince the judges to vote that I, in fact, was a real person.
Right. And that's so even though no one has won the Turing test in the Loebner Prize, every year they give out a award for the most human computer and the most human.
That's
right.
right.
Which is where you get the
Yes, yeah, that's right. It's a very strange award. So, the test is designed to confer this prize called the Most Human Computer Award that goes to the programming team whose program does the best job of fooling the judges. But because the judges are assigning scores to all of their conversations without knowing whether they're people or not, there also every year emerges a person who has done the best job of persuading the judges they're a person. And they win this sort of tongue-in-cheek prize called the Most Human Award. So I effectively set my sights on this very strange and coveted award. Yeah.
Right. And what's funny is some of the people who have lost that award over the years. You have this nugget in there about the Shakespeare scholar who couldn't convince anybody she was a human.
Yeah, that's right. There have been some tragicomic cases of people adopting precisely the wrong strategy. So there was a Shakespeare expert who decided, well, computers can't understand anything about, the arts. So I've got this thing in the bank. People will ask me questions about Shakespeare, and I'm just going to, lay it on. I'm going to give them the, PhD thesis version. I'm going to be quoting entire scenes from memory and, offering all of this analysis. And the consensus among the judges was, no one knows that much about Shakespeare. And so she was unanimously voted a computer.
The least human.
Yeah.
The least human human.
That's got to damage your psyche, actually. Well, so you got the idea to write the book based on kind of hearing about the prize and thinking that would be a good idea, or kind of this soup of philosophy and computer science that you had done in undergraduate work, that you had always been mulling on this in some way?
It was more the latter. I had this extremely strange trio of degrees and was used to raising my great aunt's eyebrows at family gatherings. Computer science, philosophy, and poetry. What are you possibly going to do with that? And I didn't really know, but in graduate school, I'd started writing these essays and trying to think about how technology affects the way that we think about ourselves in daily life. And it was around that time that I started reading these things about the 2008 contest, that the computers were one vote short. And I thought, the Turing Test is this perfect sort of coalescing of all these kind of anxious philosophical questions that people have about, what is it that makes humans special? And that's been a question that's gone all the way down, the Western philosophical canon. Descartes is really worried about it. Plato's really worried about it. Aristotle's really worried about it. And typically what they've done is to say, well, we need to figure out what makes humans different from animals. So all that stuff about navigating three-dimensional space with, motor skills and perceiving and sensing and communicating to one another, that's just beast stuff. That's not very important. But we humans have this very unique ability to do mathematics and algebra and deductive reasoning. In short, precisely rational thought. Or, you know, at some level you might think of it as everything that our cell phones now outperform us at. And so that, for me, like having a philosophical background, was extremely fascinating. That the development of the computer as this thing that lacks precisely all of those animal skills that philosophers had swept under the rug, but has in spades the thing that they held up to be, you know, the unique achievement of humanity, the ability of this cold, logical thought. It seemed like it was going to force kind of like an overturning of basically 2,000 years of Western thought.
Right.
That we were going to really have to go back to the drawing board and figure out what we're all about as a species. That to me is extremely nerve-wracking, but exciting.
Well, so it's interesting that it would be only now that we're at the point where you know, we're actually are being replaced on those levels by AI and I mean AI not just in terms of software but also hardware. I mean there's all sorts of technologies that are in effect artificial intelligence doing things for us in many parts of our daily life. You know, when we think about cars, this
Right.
notion of self-driving cars is always something we're going to get in science fiction movies. But you know, cars now park themselves. They will not. They brake for us. Basically, they brake better than human.
Right.
They won't let us get too close to the car in front of them. I mean, these are all ways of the car saying, the little chip in the car saying, we can do this better than you can. So you just get out. They push you out of the driving for that moment,
Yeah.
and they take over.
The Google guy who's running that program
Yeah.
has this line. It's like it's extremely intense rhetoric. He says, it's unethical for humans to drive cars because we're so bad. And it's so dangerous.
Well, it's yeah.
Yeah.
I mean, the line is that I mean, some people take it to the degree that you know, it's not. The argument is we shouldn't be texting while we're driving. Actually, we should be texting while we're driving. The car should be doing the driving, and we should be doing the texting.
Yeah.
But I mean, this is this kind of horizon. I mean, it's called the vanishing horizon, right? Of AI, where it's something that you always talk about. Artificial intelligence is something that's going to happen in the future,
Right.
And yet we keep on getting closer and closer to it, especially in the last 20 years, and we don't notice it as AI. We don't necessarily call it AI, and yet it's there. I mean, it is very
Right.
much already in our lives. Is that something that you were wrestling with as you were trying to retain and in some sense exaggerate your humanity?
Yeah, I mean, yes, and I think it's something at some level that we're all wrestling with. You know, I mean, one of the big anxieties when you bring up AI is people think about their job security. And there does seem to be this kind of inexorable push of computers into one domain and then the next. One thing that I do take heart in, though, is the order in which computers are pushing into these things is extremely counterintuitive. It's sort of like evolution running backwards. You know, so if you go to London, London cab drivers have this thing called the knowledge, which is London is this insane medieval layout, and cabbies are required by law to choose the most efficient route from any place to any other place. And so they literally have to study for 3 to 4 years and take this extremely intense comprehensive exam where they do a bunch of hypothetical route plans for people. And this is called the knowledge. And that's something that people do in their mid-20s. But they've been driving the car since they were 15. And so what I find really fascinating and kind of telling about the way AI is moving into things is that we've had AI in control of the knowledge now for years. I mean, it's very mundane to get into a cab, and the cabbie has absolutely no idea where anything in the city is. which I find a little distressing. And yet they can drive the car perfectly well. You know, so we've got this weird thing where...
And you're steering them from the back seat with your iPhone.
Yes.
You're telling them when to turn and where to turn, and that they are the robot in a sense, right? They're just
right. They're just executing the Google algorithm at that point. And I think it's emblematic of two things, and one is that it's this notion of AI as evolution going backwards, that what we are surprised to discover, we think that knowing your way around the city, you know, having the knowledge of London, is more impressive than being able to drive down the street and buy milk. In fact, it's precisely the opposite. That the skills that you acquire earlier in life are far more computationally complex, require way greater degree of number crunching and horsepower than these more sort of effete skills that we acquire as adults. That to me is really surprising and kind of exhilarating in the sense that the true complexities of daily life are precisely the things that we take for granted. You know, you're walking down the sidewalk, and I sometimes, this joke doesn't work because we're sitting down, but I sometimes joke if I'm giving a talk at a lectern that, you know, no one's impressed with the fact that I haven't fallen over, you know, that I'm balancing on 2 feet. But the Segway has 3 computers in it, dedicated only to keeping it upright.
right.
So it's like these things that strike us as completely unimpressive are in fact extremely complicated.
So